Silent Screams presents quite a ride, spine-chilling horror stories in the dark. The night was still, and a blanket of fog hovered over the desolate forest, thickening like the breath of some unseen, watchful entity. Silence reigned, broken only by the occasional distant rustle, as if the trees themselves were whispering secrets to each other. The moon, pale and full, cast a haunting glow over everything, illuminating shadows that stretched and writhed across the path like skeletal fingers reaching out, desperate to touch anything that dared come near. This was the perfect setting for a horror story, or rather, three interconnected ones that, woven together, became a single nightmare. And so we enter, eyes wide and hearts pounding, into the chilling unknown. The first story begins with a young woman named Sarah, alone on an empty road, her old, sputtering car struggling up a narrow, winding mountain path. Her heart raced with the rapid thumping of the engine, almost in sync, as it huffed up the steep incline. She had never intended to be out here at this time of night, and her unease grew with every mile she pushed forward into the dark, unforgiving wilderness. It was only supposed to be a shortcut, she thought, though she regretted that decision now, her phone long dead and no way to check her route. Fog had settled thick and low across the road, swallowing her headlights and distorting her vision, as if bending the light to keep her lost. The trees seemed to bend toward her, clawing at her car as she drove, their branches scraping the sides in a way that sounded eerily like fingernails scratching at glass. She tried to shake off the uneasy feeling building in her gut, dismissing it as paranoia, until she glanced in her rearview mirror. A faint figure sat in the back seat, so still and pale that she almost mistook it for a shadow cast by the headlights behind her. But there were no cars behind her. The foggy, winding road was empty as far as she could see. Her pulse quickened as she tried to convince herself it was a trick of the light, a trick of her tired mind, until she blinked and the figure's head slowly turned to face her. Its eyes were hollow, black pits, and a crooked smile stretched across its ghostly face, sending an icy shiver down her spine. She slammed on the brakes, nearly skidding off the road as she whipped around to look into the back seat. But when she turned, there was nothing there, only empty space and the faint echo of a child's laugh, soft, chilling, and echoing faintly as if carried on the breeze. Her heart hammered against her ribcage as she sat frozen, her hands gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white. The figure was gone, but the feeling of being watched lingered, settling deep into her bones. Meanwhile, in a small weathered town a few miles away, another story was unfolding. Mike had been driving down the same foggy road when he spotted an old house that seemed abandoned, its windows shattered, paint peeling, and surrounded by trees that looked as though they had been untouched for decades. Against his better judgment, he decided to pull over and explore. Curiosity, after all, was a dangerous thing, but he was an urban explorer, someone who sought out places like this, places with secrets waiting to be unearthed. As he approached the house, a cold wind swept past him, carrying with it the faint scent of decay and something else, something sharp and metallic. He glanced back at his car, parked haphazardly on the side of the road, the last comforting connection he had to the outside world. But he pressed forward, his footsteps crunching on the dead leaves scattered across the ground as he approached the decrepit house. The front door creaked open with a reluctant groan, and he stepped inside, shining his flashlight over the dusty, rotting interior. Old furniture lay scattered, covered in dust and cobwebs, as if frozen in time. His light caught an old family portrait on the wall, the faces barely visible through the grime. But when he wiped it clean, he froze. The family, a mother, father, and two children, had hollow, empty eyes and smiles that seemed to stretch too wide, too unnatural. Their expressions were lifeless, cold, yet somehow mocking him as if they knew a secret he did not. Just then, a faint whisper echoed through the house, so soft it was almost a murmur. Mike felt his pulse quicken as he strained to listen. It was unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakable, a desperate, pleading voice, almost like a cry for help. He took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to leave, but something held him there, a force stronger than fear, urging him to uncover the mystery lurking within the house. He moved further into the house, his footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust. The air grew colder with every step, chilling him to the bone. Just as he turned a corner, he spotted a figure in the shadows. It was a woman, her dress torn and dirty, her hair matted and hanging over her face. She stood motionless, her head tilted slightly as if listening to something only she could hear. And then, as if sensing his gaze, she lifted her head and looked directly at him. Her eyes were empty, dark hollows, yet they seemed to pull him in, to draw him closer despite the terror gripping his heart. The woman let out a slow, eerie smile, her mouth stretching inhumanly wide. Then she took a step toward him, her bare feet dragging across the floor with a dreadful scraping sound. Panic surged through him as he stumbled back, nearly tripping over his own feet as he tried to retreat. But the woman kept coming, each step slow and deliberate, her hollow eyes never leaving his. He turned and ran, his breaths coming in ragged gasps as he dashed toward the door. But when he reached it, he found it locked, as if the house itself had decided to trap him within its decaying walls. Desperately, he tugged at the door handle, glancing back, to see the woman now only a few feet away, her face contorted into a grotesque smile that seemed to grow with every step. Her hand reached out, her bony fingers stretching toward him, and just as they were about to graze his shoulder, the door flew open. He stumbled out, falling onto the porch, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. Behind him, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, and when he looked back, the woman was gone. But the whispering remained, faint and haunting, as if the very walls of the house were alive and would never forget his presence. Meanwhile, in the eerie, fog-laden graveyard that bordered the town, a third soul found themselves in a nightmare of their own. Emily was visiting her grandmother's grave, something she did every year on this exact night, when she felt a chill that seemed to seep up from the ground, gripping her ankles and refusing to let go. The fog had thickened around her, swallowing the headstones until they seemed to float in an endless sea of gray. She tried to ignore the unsettling sensation, whispering a soft prayer as she placed flowers by the grave, but the unease continued to build, tightening her chest with an inexplicable fear. As she stood, she heard the faint crunch of footsteps behind her, slow and methodical. Emily's pulse quickened, but she kept her gaze on the ground, refusing to look back. Maybe it was just another mourner, she told herself, someone visiting a loved one at this unusual hour. But when the footsteps stopped, the silence grew so intense it pressed against her eardrums, leaving her breathless. Then a whisper echoed through the fog, a name, her name, spoken in a voice she recognized but couldn't place. Against her better judgment, she turned, and her heart plummeted. Just a few feet away stood a figure, translucent and shrouded in mist, their features obscured, but their eyes were unmistakable. They glowed faintly in the dark, like coals smoldering beneath ash, and they were fixed directly on her. Emily felt rooted to the spot, her legs refusing to obey as the apparition drew closer. The ghostly figure stretched out a hand, its fingers twisting and bending in unnatural ways, each movement slow and deliberate, as if savoring her fear. Emily's mind screamed for her to run, but her body remained paralyzed, trapped in the spectral gaze of the apparition. The air around her grew colder, each breath forming a visible cloud before her, and she realized, with a chill that reached her core, that the graveyard was silent, eerily, impossibly silent. Not a single sound broke the stillness, as if the world itself had paused, holding its breath, waiting. And then, with a voice like the rustling of dry leaves, the apparition whispered again, its words chilling her to the bone.